On today's Ask Zach, we're going to talk about how I've been a hard-headed idiot and how my clean sound has been too clean, and how, despite the help from others and people trying to tell me this, I haven't listened to them. That I needed to add some hair to my clean signal to make it sit in the mix better and to make it sound better. We're going to talk about that. Well, hello, friends, and welcome to Ask Zach. Yes, today we're going to talk about what a big dummy I am and how I haven't listened to my friends' input for years that kept saying, maybe you need to goose up your tone a little bit. You need to, add a little hair to it. And I've always been like, no, I want it to be this clean. I want it to be this clean. And, I've always, used compressors and never turned the amp up past 5. Just to always kind of erred on the side of frankly, overly clean. And of course, a lot of you guys can attest to that if you've watched the show for a while. But what I found from the feedback that I was getting, which I wasn't, it's one thing to play by yourself on the show and you just hear the guitar. But when you hear the guitar in the context of a band or a recording, whether it's live or, going into a recording studio, all of a sudden you realize that your guitar tone has to be dirtier and it has to have elements that help it to cut through the mix and to sound good. And a big element of that, can be using a compressor, but I think a better way is using some type of low-level dirty boost or something like that that allows you to get a tone that melds better, that sits in the mix better. So we're going to dive into all that today. But first, quick pause for the cause. I need to thank my Patreon members and everyone that supported the channel, put money in the tip jar, picked up a t-shirt or a coffee mug. Thank you. All right, so let's dive in. So I've already, confessed to the fact that I've played too clean. And that's fine when you're playing, by yourself. But, when you're playing in a band context or you're recording, you find that you really need a sound that has these elements that help it to sit in the mix better. And again, I tried to do it with compression a lot, which that can do it. But one of the things I've found over the last 25 years, and again, I'm just kind of putting all this together now, is that most of the clean sounds that I liked are dirtier than I thought. So my first experience with this was I got to go to a sound check of a great guitar player that I admire. And I got to hear his amps, up close. And he didn't have any effects on. And the guy was known for playing, fairly clean. And I thought, wow, this is going to be terrible because, his amps are too distorted. And I almost wanted to say something to him or the guitar tech, but I didn't. And so then, of course, I went out, with the audience to watch the show. And guess what? It sounded perfect. And it didn't sound as dirty. But I asked the guitar tech afterwards, I said, did y'all change things? Because it sounded, I told him, I said, it sounded too dirty to me, when we were backstage. I said, but then, through the PA and with everything else, it sounded perfect. And he said, I don't know if that's the PA or what, but yeah, we certainly didn't do anything to the guitar tone. We didn't change any settings. So that kind of made me start thinking. Then another thing I noticed, of course, I've done a lot of interviews with guitarists, and most guitar players used compressor pedals in the 80s and 90s. And then in the 2000s, I started noticing that a lot of guitar players, a lot of session guitar players were ditching their compressor pedals. And instead they started having multiple, overdrive pedals, and they had like a low, medium, and heavier drive pedals, and they would stack them in different ways. And one thing I wasn't noticing was that a lot of them were leaving on the low level drive pedal almost all the time, and you didn't really notice it because it was still pretty clean. Then more recently, actually just a couple of years ago, I interviewed Duke Levine, and he was another guy that was using compressors, and he had stopped doing that. And in fact, he had flown into town to do some recording that Tom Bukovac had invited him to be a part of, and he had a pedal board, no compressor on it, and he was in town to record. And I found out from talking to him that even his clean sound, he would turn one of the drive pedals on and really low. And again, you wouldn't notice it in context, but by itself, it just sounded like, oh well, it's kind of a dirty, cleanish sound. Then last year, I was part of a Fender event, and I got to jam with some heavy duty guitar players, and I had this broadcaster with me, and I didn't bring an amp, and so they had a deluxe reverb reissue for me to plug into, and the other guys were playing really loud, and I had to turn that deluxe up to 10 just to hear myself, just to cut through. And I thought, this is going to sound like poop. I mean, this is going to just be terrible. And because like when I was playing, I was like, this is too distorted. This is not my sound. But then the next day, when people that were at the event posted some video and I could hear myself soloing with that sound, I was like, it's a little dirty, but it sounds great. It really worked well, and it sounded good in, the crude mix of the event. Then, more recently, I started asking a lot more questions, and, when I got to do some recording and such, and like, what are y'all, because people are always using plugins and all sorts of stuff on guitars, and I'm not super recording savvy. And I found out that besides, of course, people are EQing and sometimes compressing stuff, but one of the things that's just used a ton on every instrument, drums, voices, bass, guitars, everything, is a lot of times they'll add dirt to stuff. I can remember hearing a track and thinking, wow, everything sounded great. And he soloed the bass, and the bass was quite a bit dirtier. And it was not all full like grunge sounding, but it had a fair amount of dirt on it. But again, you didn't notice it in the track. And they had put it on like keyboards, they'd put it on everything. And they even, at one point, they took all of it off globally, the dirt. And the recording just didn't sound as good because the dirt was making everything congeal better. It just made everything, like you could still hear everything individually, but it was like that soup or that pot of spaghetti, sauce that's been, sitting on the stove for 10 hours or something like that. I mean, it was just amazing how, you could, taste all the flavors, but everything, really came together perfectly. So I started realizing that I really needed to do something different. Also, I had played a gig with my buddy Paul Bogart, and a friend of mine came to the show, and he did some recording, and I was really not happy with my tone. And I was using a 57 Esquire with a 1965 Deluxe reverb. And it was like, I mean, those are great tools. And so obviously it's user error. So I started realizing I need to add dirt to my tone. I need to have a dirtier tone than I think I do, because that helps things congeal. It helps things cut through. And my buddy Austin, who's a great player here in town, a great old friend, and other friends too, had been telling me that I needed to get a dirtier sound. And they would try to get me to turn up or whatever. But really the thing that they were trying to do is trying to get a dirtier sound, because they knew that was important to cut through and to sound good. So, Of course, there's a lot of different ways of doing that, of getting hair. The easiest way would be just to turn your amp up. But you can't always do that because sometimes, when you get the amp sounding just right, it's too loud. Now, of course, you could get a load box or do some other things, but really the simplest thing to do is to just have a low level dirt box that you can just adjust as needed and just bring in some nice dirt. So I thought about what was I going to use for that, and I tried the distortion and I wasn't real happy with it, but other people do use that pedal for that. And then I remembered a pedal that was really, really popular here in Nashville years ago, and that's the old RC booster. So this guy's, everyone's seen one of these. I mean, they used to be on everyone's board, and then, of course, things kind of change and things become flavor of the month or whatever, but I still had one, and I plugged it in, and because I remembered it was good at getting like low-level drives, and sure enough, you could get some really nice low-level drives. So here, let's finally, after all this yammering, let's play a little bit. So I've got a 1968 Princeton Reverb that I'm playing through today. And it's got a Fat Jimmy C1025 speaker. And let's play a little bit. So this is dry. Actually, there is some slapback. But here, this is without the RC booster on. Here it is with the RC booster on. And here's some single note playing without. And with the RC. So, of course, when I hit it harder, you can hear it, distorting, or like here's a full chord. If I turn it off, but it sounds better in context, when you're with a band. And the principle is not so outlandish. I mean, think about, plugging a telly straight into a PA. Well, it's going to sound terrible. Why do we like tube amps? Well, one, they're catered toward a guitar, but also we like tube amps because they're doing all sorts of different things that basically distort and massage the signal. And we like that because it fuzzes the edges. That's what we like. We don't want a perfect image with perfect lines. We like the lines kind of distorted. We like it soft and warm. And that comes from distortion of different ways. Now, that doesn't mean, I want to sound like Metallica, but it does mean that, I don't want that clean, overly crisp sound, because you want that kind of compression and such that comes with turning the amp up or even using a low drive pedal, because there's a way, an overdrive pedal, when it's using the clipping diodes, kind of give you a level of compression. And so it kind of helps you to eliminate that, where you don't need to have a compressor pedal because it's kind of compressing things to a degree and not so radically. So it's a really, really cool, wonderful thing. So just a little more, because of course, even on the neck pickup, I mean, it's fine. Then if I turn it off, it's like the without having the RC booster on, it's just like it just feels like you have more transients and stuff, and it just feels like everything congeals better. Now, a lot of you guys are thinking ZAC is a big dummy and he's so way behind the times. This is what guitar players have been doing forever. And at this point, I would agree. Yes, so I'm going to be using a dirtier, clean sound from here on out, whether I do it with the amp or the RC booster or something else. And I'm not a exotic endorser, and they didn't give me anything, and this is an old one, so I know they still make them, but you can do this with all sorts of things. You don't have to have that. You could use a Timmy or a Mad Professor Blue overdrive, Royal Blue, like Duke Levine does. You can use all sorts of different things. So, or a load box, and turn your amp up and get it to get a little hairier, or an aux box. There's all sorts of options here. But I guess, yeah, for me, ditching a compressor, using a low-level dirt box, having things cut through the mix better, I mean, to me, that's a big deal, and something I wish I had done years ago. So there you have it, guys. I hope you enjoyed today's episode, and don't have your clean sound too dirty, and don't have your dirty sound too clean. I don't know. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.